this is our critical moment here, and we're looking at ways to break down the Maroczy Bind pawn structure, which means we need to find ways for black to try to exchange a pawn for one of these two pawns. So you can pause here and see if you can work out what your thematic ideas are, not necessarily what move to play right now, but how we're going to try to trade for one of these two pawns. And if you thought of the moves b5, d5, and f5, that makes a lot of sense, because these are the only ways that you can trade for the c and e pawns. Now, obviously f5 is illegal, so we could try to arrange that, but it might not be my first choice, because it's difficult to get it going. Hello Phoenix, welcome to the chat. I'm glad that you missed the first 7 minutes where I was just talking to myself, because I forgot to change scenes. Now d5 is really, really hard to get through. In fact, d5 almost never works against the Maroczy Bind, but if you can get it, it will just destroy white's opening strategy, so that's one to look out for, even if it's the most difficult to achieve. But we're going to look for b5 in this game. How can we achieve it? If we play b5 immediately, then they can only take with a pawn, which is kind of encouraging. You might want to pause here and see why they can't take with the knight. Just try to imagine it. And the reason is that the e-pawn's hanging. So we can use this temporary pressure on e4 to try to arrange the b5 break. It's just one factor that can help us to get it going. Which also suggests that even before white castles, they might want to play a move like f3 to stabilize. So this is part of why there's some urgency for black to actually get something going against the Maroczy Bind. If you let white get the fully developed setup where c4 is safe and e4 is safe, and none of the pieces can be traded, then white just has control of the position. And even if it's equal, it's very hard for black to walk that path. So in this game, which is Cardoso versus Adorjan, Adorjan chose queen a5 to try to put some pressure on. And Cardoso castled. I'm wondering now if f3 was a more reasonable move. But this was not really noted in Soltis' notes, and these games are based on Soltis' arrangement from his book Pawn Structure Chess, which I highly recommend, even though it's a very old book that's not backed by engine analysis. So they castled. Now we're still trying to get b5 in. So let's think about how can we arrange b5 a little bit better. I think I understand why Cardoso chose not to play f3. He probably wants to play f4 in one move, something a little bit more ambitious. I think in recent times when people play the Maroczy Bind, it pays to be a little patient. You can play f3 and eventually you're going to get your break in, as long as you don't allow black a quick f5, d5, or b5. So here we're really going for it with a6. So this is clearly supporting the move b5. And at this point, white could also play f3. Now, when we're faced with such positions, it's good to ask, well, what happens if we just go ahead and play it anyway? What happens if we play the move b5 that we were preparing, even though it looks like they're resisting us pretty strongly with 3 attackers on that square? So you might want to pause and calculate here. Yeah, Phoenix, don't put in moves while driving. That's not a good idea. Although I do have to say that when I was at my most busy, when I was still coaching full-time, I would often have a book in my car, and I'd look at a position, and I'd drive for a while thinking about the position, and then I'd look at the position again later on. So, as is often the case with coaches, do as I say, not as I do. So after f3, if we just play d5, the only really challenging move is if they take on b5. So naturally, I would consider taking back. And you'll notice that there's this pressure on a2. So at the very least, we're going to capture one of these queenside pawns. For example, knight takes, I would probably take with the... Let me see. I would probably take here first, and then take with the rook, in order to avoid like knight c7 type stuff. It's still an interesting position, but you know, black's clearly making progress in this case. If they take with the bishop, then I'm tempted to win the e pawn instead of the a pawn. With a typical tactic in this structure, if it works. Otherwise, it's just a typical blunder in the structure. Knight takes e4, and after f takes, we can take here. And now there's no way to save everything. For instance, maybe pawn takes to try to reestablish your Maroczy Bind pawn structure, although that's silly logic. And now we have some opposite bishop situation where white has a lot of weaknesses. So you have to look for these early tactical blows as black, not get too complacent, allow white to consolidate. So I think that's how we would handle it if they played f3 at this moment. It's probably important for them to get it going a little bit faster, for white to play f3 earlier. Yeah, I wonder what they saw here that bothered them. I think they really just wanted to play f4 in one move. So anyway, after the move f4, you shouldn't be surprised that black is playing b5, because that's what they were playing for. And after pawn takes, they could take on b5, but this runs into problems like what we've already seen. White does have a move to maintain equality here, though. And I would challenge you guys to try to find white's equalizing move, because I think it's quite difficult when you are expecting to get the stable pawn structure to start backpedaling and play for equality in a totally new structure. So when you get in a break like this, it often has a practical advantage as well as a significant impact on the evaluation of the position. The move that I think equalizes here is bishop f3. We're just defending against the threat to the e-pawn and trying to keep our bishops active. We'll probably lose a pawn, but, you know, that's life. So b4 is what was chosen by Cardoso, which I think is a really poor reaction. I went through a time where I would consistently go up a pawn, and it was often an outside pawn like the a pawn, and this extra pawn, when all the pieces are on the board, generally will not advance that easily. So I think that trying to play b4 in order to trade pawns and keep the a pawn, it's kind of like you're just saddling yourself with a weak pawn forever. So I think b4 is a really poor decision, and the position deteriorated from here. I can show a few moves. So this is threatening to take the knight. Bishop d4 is a sort of thematic move, because you often, in positions with more space, want to trade the bishop that protects their king and then just expand on that side of the board. But here black has a tactical blow, so if you want, you could pause here or comment in the chat, whichever suits you, and see what is black's best move. Since this is a tactical blow, we should be looking at the forcing moves, right? So the most forcing move that comes to my mind is either knight takes e4 or rook takes c3. Knight takes e4 is not impressive, because after knight takes e4, it seems like one of your potential targets is running away. So it's not knight takes e4 on move 1, but on move 2. So we take here. Bit of a tricky move to see, because they can take with the queen. If they take with the bishop, this is obviously really good, because now we have 3 pieces attacking c3. So The really important thing to see is that after knight takes e4, if they play queen takes, we have this intermediate move. Hope you spotted it. Bishop takes d4 check, and then we take the queen on a3. So they can't just trade queens. So it's also interesting to ask, what is White's best way of trying to deal with this? In fact, the game has a sort of interesting finale. The best move is rook b8. Phoenix is bragging about his banger donuts in the chat. Come on, where's my donut? Can't go on about donuts without sharing. Did you bring enough for the class? Anyway, so rook takes b8, and this is losing the queen. But you'll notice that this position has massive compensation for black. This is no longer about the Maroczy Bind. This is just like really interesting chess. After bishop takes d4, king h1's forced, and after knight f2 they have to give up even more material, and now we reach sort of a pause in the conflict where black has a rook and two bishops against a queen and bishop, and their pawn on a2 is really weak, so they would have to advance it pretty far, like to a6, to make something of it in this life, but that's not really going to happen because there's some back rank threats they need to deal with. So they start with h3, and Adorjan handled this position really well. He gained space with h5. This is also avoiding pesky moves like bishop g4, which could provoke f5, and then your king might be kind of weak. Although even there, I'm not sure it's like that bad. Maybe you could play king f7. Anyway, so h5, just a normal common sense move. Queen f3 is attacking the bishop and preparing to play a move like a4. But here comes rook b1, and I don't think they can really avoid having this really awkward position. So they play queen e4, because if they play the move a4, what's going to happen? You could pause here if you're still looking for the tactics for black. I think it's rook b3, attacking the queen and the king. And you might have noticed that they can block here, but after bishop f5, or even bishop c4, actually I prefer bishop f5, we're going to win at least one of these pieces. h4 is just a waste, because if you play h4 in this position, they can play king takes h4, and I don't think you have anything there. So this is actually interesting because Adorjan forced the king onto g3 a few moves earlier, seemingly like in a superfluous way, because he really could have just moved the bishop here, right? But instead he chose to put the pieces in the most active configuration and like make these guys awkwardly placed. So just a little bit of tactical finesse here. So he ended up winning that a pawn that was weak, and now black has seemingly so many pawns, should be completely winning. And he just converted this really nicely. Chop chop. The d pawn's starting to look like a queen. Alright, and so that's how the game ended. So, very interesting way that black was able to break out. It's worth mentioning that you can't always just throw b5. It's a pretty typical technique, but it doesn't work every single time. So, here's another example with very much the same opening. But this was played by Tal against Parma. And this is really the same exact position. And the way that white should have handled this, and I think they retain an advantage, is with b3, which just protects all these queenside weaknesses. So when black is developing an attack against the queenside pieces, you protect those queenside pieces quickly. And then after rook c8, they castled anyway, and they got in f4, so it makes sense. They didn't have to make a pit stop to play f3 because the queenside is all safe. And then here, Parma just went for b5, which probably makes sense. I'm not sure. Yeah, and probably b5 still makes sense here, but here Tala went for f5, and it seems like they never really had any chance. Bishop d7, pawn takes g6, they should definitely take back. And then here it's white to play, and I just want to see what you guys think white should do about the, I guess how they should develop their initiative. It's a good way of framing it. You might remember from the last session that one of the typical ways that white obtains an advantage against the black setup is by playing moves which leave a weak pawn on d6. So that's a small hint here. The move is c5, which has a tactical justification. It's that if you take this pawn like this, then after e5 your bishop's hanging. You might play like knight g4 and then this bishop's hanging as well, but after a move like knight d5 I'd expect that you're not in such great shape. For example, so the queen's hanging, so you have to play queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, and then the e7 pawn's hanging, and I guess you have to defend that with a move like maybe king f8 is the easiest, but then there's knight b6. So white's development just kind of comes together. Yeah, rook takes f6 also works. This is one of the ideas that I had in my mind initially. Wait, hold on. It does not work because after rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes, the knight's hanging on c3. I think that's it. So anyway, so that's just an interesting tidbit here. They can't really take it. So after bishop e6, Tal played bishop f3, and after pawn takes c5, he got e5 in. So e5 is one of the typical breaks for white, and this example, black was not able to get it going, even though they got the b5 break in. And this is part of why I think the Maroczy Bind pawn structure is so good. Even though black has a pretty well-defined way of trying to manage the situation, it's practically very, very difficult. Even if you get in the break that you want, you might not make it. So just playing a couple moves here because I think there was an interesting tactical finish that I just want to show. I'm looking for the interesting part. Let me see. Queen c7, knight g5, rook f8. All right, rook f8 was a blunder, and here there's a small tactic for white. So if you want to just pause and see. What should white play to win here? Of course, we're looking for forcing moves first here, but I think having a high level view of the game also makes sense here. So conceptually, if there's going to be a tactic, it probably involves the fact that all these pieces are on the same color and unprotected. MK, welcome and thank you. Queen f5 is definitely the move, and they resigned because however they capture, there's knight e6 and they're just down a piece. A hideous ending. Yeah, nice job. But let's see an example where black's a little bit more successful. So this is in asymmetrical English, which is another opening where one typically sees the Maroczy Bind. And this time, white's fianchettoing the bishop on the king side. In the other games that we saw today, they put the bishop on e2. Here they got e4 with tempo, so I think black's opening was really horrible, but that's just me. So anyway, here's b3, consolidating the queen side. Black played queen d7, which has a pretty transparent plan behind it. So if you want to pause here or comment in the chat, what do you think black's intending to do here to try to alleviate their space problems? What could they possibly be up to? I'll give you a hint. It's not b5, because even though queen d7 attacks the b5 square, white has one fewer attackers on b5 compared to the last game. the e4 pawn is more solid compared to the other position because of the bishop on g2. So there's no tactics involving attacking on e4. Yeah, MK has it, so bishop h3 is the idea. For black, in this situation, this could be associated with developing an attack on the king, but that only really seems to work when white makes a major mistake. I tried to play this kind of plan or some similar plans against the Maroczy Bind many times, and against strong opposition, nothing really ever materializes from this. But if you do get in bishop h3, then you can at least trade one pair of pieces, and then that might help you to deal with your space disadvantage later in the game. Although white still has a space advantage. It's not like game changing, but you know, it's an idea. Another way you can get something like this is you can play queen a5 to h5 and then bishop h3 from wherever the bishop is. So this is typical. It's at least something to do in the meanwhile while you kind of wait to die against the Maroczy Bind, because I don't know, I think Maroczy Bind's really good. Now here white made a mistake. They played rook fd1. I think this is mistaken for multiple reasons. First of all, I think that in the structure you really want to get an f4 and f5. It's kind of like if you close your eyes and just play some moves, you might play like rook ad1, knight d5, f4, and f5. That's kind of like my eyes are shut, I'm just playing the Maroczy Bind the way I always play it kind of moves. So rook fd1 is in the way of playing rook ad1. So let's say rook fd1. Black's idea was maybe to play bishop h3, but they have another idea at their disposal. So let's see if you guys can figure out another strong idea for black. And it will probably help you to think about which of the pawn breaks black is going to be able to obtain reasonably in this position. Is it going to be b5, d5, or f5? Phoenix, in this case, if you play b5, I think they'll just take it with the pawn. And I'm guessing you want to take back, allow knight takes b5 maybe, and then play knight takes e4. That's my guess about why you're playing b5 here. So we're gonna see something kind of like this. A lot of chopping, and then maybe a tactical idea with knight e4. Oh, okay. So you're saying we have to prep b5. All right, not a direct b5. How can you prepare b5 more in this position? I think a6 and queen d7 has really prepared b5 well. So you might try like rook a b8 or something. I don't know if this is anti-position or not, but I think after rook b8, white could probably get away with just playing a4. Because black has relatively low maneuverability. It might be hard for them to take advantage of the outpost square on b4. Like, what piece can even get there quickly, given that white has put up this fence with c4 and e4. So I think white could maybe just put the kibosh on b5 altogether at that point. And d5 is clearly out of the question, I think. So let's look at f5. How can we possibly get the f5 break in? Well, this knight's in the way, so we should figure out where to put the knight. I think the most obvious choice is knight g4. Because after knight g4, which is what was played in the game, you're heading to e5, you're activating this bishop, and you also can get f5 in. There's like nothing else to do. Knight e8's a little too passive. I wonder though if knight e8 works. Knight e8 seems like the dual purpose version. Like you might want to try to prepare b5 by playing knight c7, although it looks kind of contrived to me. By the way, preparing b5 with the bishop on g2 is difficult tactically, so you might want to just keep that in mind. But here, given that black wants to play f5, what would I do here? Interesting moment. Yeah, I'm not sure how I'm going to meet f5 here. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, maybe knight e8 also works. In the game they chose knight g4, and white tried to clamp against the move b5, which was a mistake as well. Here, maybe they should play something like this. Where they play f4, and I don't know, I think black is doing fine here as well. So I think that probably either of these knight moves are good, and they really should have gotten into f4 faster than this. So they played a4, and here comes f5, and now black has pretty much fully equalized. I think that every time you get one of these breaks in for black, as long as there's not some like cascade of tactical consequences like in the last example, you are getting away with what you really need. You're equalizing, and then you can start thinking about playing for a win. So rook f1 was white's choice. Saidy against Reshevsky decided to try to fix their mistake by choosing this rook. But after knight e5, queen e3, pawn takes e4, the position's like totally opened up for black's pieces. So let's just see a couple more moves. Hangs h3. What's hanging h3? Knight e8. So after knight e8, I wasn't sure about this. Alright, what's hanging on h3? I don't think I ever put any piece on h3. Oh, I think I know what you mean. h3, knight e5, queen e2, and then they'll play bishop takes h3. Is that such a big deal? Hold on, let me see. So they take here. Yeah, I guess it is a big deal, because even if we play a move like knight d5 here, I don't know, sometimes positions like this, like you lose the pawn, but it doesn't even matter. I guess it's a little bit too much. They should have really put this rook on d1. Yeah, you're right, it does just hang the h-pawn. So I missed that. So h3 is no bueno. And f3 runs into a similar problem. Okay, so anyway, so the way the game went, they traded off the bishop that defends white's king and got rook f3 in. Yeah, thanks for the comment, MK. I didn't catch that. Yeah, so we got rook f3 in, and you can tell that black just has a phenomenal initiative here. I don't think you really need, like, once you see that you're getting an f5 and there's no like real problems with it, you can kind of count on your position developing in your favor. I think part of why they play rook f1 here is that if they play something kind of obvious, like you might say after f5, h3 is no longer hanging because the bishop's blocked. First of all, that doesn't make very much sense. But this also runs into knight takes f2. So this is why they were playing rook f1. And this is a check. So anyway, rook f1. That's how we got here, where they're trading off the defenders and rook f3 gets in. And now all the light squares are weak. I think that's a common situation where all the light squares get weak after the break occurs, because in the Maroczy Bind you put all your pawns on one color, which goes against the beginner logic that I've sometimes explained in my videos. I'm like, hey, you shouldn't put all your pawns on just one color because it can lead to tactical problems. Well, the Maroczy Bind is sort of exceptional in that you can put all your pawns on one color without having trouble, but it starts to feel very much like you made a beginner mistake if your opponent is able to get a break and destroy that pawn structure, because then you just have a position that makes no sense with pawns all on one color, and it's just weak. By the way, so all on one color in one region of the board is what I'm thinking. Like here, there's weaknesses on the dark squares on the queen side, there's weaknesses on the light squares on the king side, because all the pawns are the same color in that area. So anyway, let's just see a couple more moves. How Reshevsky went down in flames, just for fun. So f2 is weak, there's putting pressure on it. And they can't take right away, so they just improve their position. Now the king's in danger. And I think there's a nice tactics puzzle moment coming up. Alright, so it's black to play and win, and welcome Yeeter Master. Alright, black to play and win. How are we going to do it? Yeah, this is a weird time for me to stream, so I definitely appreciate you guys coming out to check it out. And it's probably going to be a short stream for me because I was on the road until really early this morning, which is probably why you guys saw me active in the Discord in the middle of the night in your time zone. And I need to get back on the road again, so I'm not gonna linger too long here. Might show one more example or something if I have a really good one. Alright, Yeeter Master, I think you got it. It's knight takes g3, and white resigned here because f takes is illegal, and not taking is a different kind of suicide. So they played pawn takes. They would play pawn takes g3, but this just runs into rook takes g3, and the game's just over because there's checkmate on g2. So big old disaster. MK, maybe rook g3 is also good. Let's see. Let's just calculate it. Rook takes, pawn takes, and then I'm sure you're winning here as well, but maybe it's a little more finessed. Like knight takes g3, and maybe it's just unstoppable mate on h1. Let me see. Knight h6 check doesn't seem to do anything, so that's a good sign. Can't play any piece on e4. Maybe king h2. Yeah, I think king h2 is the problem in that line, so it would be like this. I'm guessing that you wanted to take here. I mean, you could always take the rook on e2, so this should be winning somehow. Like, I go here to avoid mate on h1, you take this, and what do we have here? Material is not even equal. Black's at least winning this in terms of how many pawns they have. Yeah, but I really like the way that Yeeter Master chose knight takes, and I don't think they have a way to avoid utter ruin, right? Because let's say they move this rook, maybe they'll put on e6 because that's a free pawn. That might have its own perils. But here, I could probably play rook c3 and you resign. That looks pretty promising. Oh, there's maybe rook g6 here. Rook g6, king f7. No. Yeah, I mean, this is probably... I think this is some kind of lights out. It's just gotta be. Maybe they could struggle on with like rook e6, but it's not convincing to me. Anyway, interesting tactical moment, just to spot knight g3. I don't think you need to see the consequences to play such a move. You know, you're just destroying the shelter of their king, and it's on them to find out what good move to play. You know, they don't have real counterplay. Okay, so that was a really nice finish. Let me just quickly check my next example to see if it was one that I wanted to show. I have all the examples from Soltis's book, but some of them are kind of redundant to me, or like make me yawn, that kind of stuff. I have another example of this f5 break. Let me see about this one. No, I think this is probably good for now. Had a decent live stream here, and I really thank you guys for coming out. I will put out more episodes about pawn structure chess in the next couple of months. A lot of it's going to draw on the material from Soltis's pawn structure chess book. So I do recommend that you guys check it out, even though it's an old book that's not backed by computer analysis. I think it has a lot of really relevant ideas, and the pawn structures that he picked are really relevant even today. Yeah, so I guess I'll see you guys in my next live stream. I might do more than normal in the next couple of weeks, so you can look forward to that new content. And until next time, take care.